All right, very well. So good morning, everyone. My name is David Phillips, and I'm the director of the program on Peacebuilding and Human Rights at Columbia University. We're very pleased that you all have joined our panel today on targeting of Christians in Turkey. We've really got an all-star lineup to discuss developments in Turkey. Of course, those presentations occur in the context of U.S.-Turkey relations and the renewed focus of the U.S. on religious freedom. There was a story in the New York Times this morning about Secretary Pompeo's Commission on Unalienable Rights and the priority that's placing on religious freedom worldwide, aligning U.S. values with the treatment of religious minorities and Christians around the world is an ongoing challenge, especially so in Turkey, which we know has been a long-standing ally, but whose recent conduct raises serious questions about its reliability and its values. Turning Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque, increasing pressure on the ecumenical patriarchate, confiscation of Armenian properties, pressure on evangelicals and Protestants, not to mention Alawites, are all issues of major concern, which we'll get into during our panel presentations today. Columbia is pleased to co-sponsor today's panel with Justice for Kurds, whose chairman is Tom Kaplan and whose director is Emily Kaplan, both of whom are with us for the discussion today. Tom is an activist, a conservationist, someone who has deep insight about matters in the Middle East and an especially strong concern about religious freedom in Turkey, in U.S.-Turkey relations. He's going to introduce our panel, and we'll hear from the panelists who will each speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. We're recording this event, so it'll be disseminated more broadly than the audience that's actually on the conference today. If you have questions or want to participate in the discussion, use your chat function. Those questions will be relayed to me by Maggie, who's our communications director and has organized the program. So we're very grateful to the panel for joining, very grateful to the distinguished audience for participating, very grateful personally to Tom Kaplan for his leadership and the opportunity to work together on these important issues. So Tom, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, David. Before I begin, though, let me express our gratitude on behalf of our co-founder of JFK, Bernard-Henri Lévy, and Emily Hamilton, who's on the webinar with us. We ourselves are extremely grateful to you, to Maggie, and to the excellent work of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia. The program on peace building and rights is really one of our great partners in being able to raise awareness, not just for the Kurds, but also for religious minorities throughout the Levant, and of course, increasingly in Turkey itself. I think it's fair to say that the arc of history shows that very often history will most closely judge a nation on the basis of how it treats its minorities. And sadly, as one who grew up for decades seeing in Turkey one of the West's most stalwart allies within NATO and as a reliable partner for regional stability, unfortunately, we're not seeing this to be the case, either outside of Turkey's borders nor within them. So with that, let me introduce the panelists who will be able to take that macro view right down to the specific. I'd like to begin with Pastor Anadrew Brunson, the former pastor for the Izmir Dirilis Church, Amber Zaman, Senior Correspondent of Al Monitor. She'll be followed by Elizabeth Promadou, the Visiting Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And our panelists will conclude, before we go into Q&A, with the author-activist Raffi Bedrosyan. So with that, if I can introduce Pastor Anadrew Brunson to kick off our panel today. Thank you.
Hi. I hope I'm the only person on this panel who has spent time in a Turkish prison. I think that's why I've been invited to participate. I was asked to describe my conditions. I was arrested along with my wife on October 7 of 2016. We were held together for a couple of weeks, and then she was released, and the Turkish government held on to me for another couple of years. I was held in solitary confinement at the beginning for just over 50 days. And after that, I was moved to a high security prison and held there, held in prison for the remainder of my time. So I went from solitary confinement to a very overcrowded cell, a cell that was built for 8 people originally, but there were over 20 of us crowded in. There was not enough room to keep all of the prisoners that were, all the people who were being arrested at the time. So we were in very overcrowded conditions, and the cells there, the kind of prison I was held in, we were held 24/7 in the cells. There were no public areas people went out into, so it's possible to spend years in those cells and never meet anyone outside of that small group of cellmates. So some of the things I really struggled with, one of them was uncertainty, because one can be held without trial in Turkey for 7 years at this point. So that's very frightening to sit in a prison cell and know that you could be there for a number of years before the case is even heard. And it was 18 months before charges were actually officially filed against me. So uncertainty was very difficult. Also isolation. I was isolated by my language, culture, life experience, nationality, and especially by my faith. I was the only Christian among all the prisoners, and all of the prisoners I was with were accused of being part of the Gulen movement. So they were all very committed Muslims. So I had uncertainty, isolation, and a loss of hope. It was very clear that the judicial system had become very politicized and was really serving the interest of the president of the country. And so one could not place any hope in a fair judicial process. I was asked how I managed my time in prison. Well, in solitary confinement, it was very difficult. It was just me and a bed, and with all the fear and uncertainty, despair, and not knowing what was going to happen. And the way I managed it was to structure my day around prayer, because it was the only thing that I could do, the only thing that provided some structure that kept me from going insane. I found solitary confinement to be very difficult. And I did come close to a point of failure. I was suicidal during my first year. My second year, I pressed into my faith much more, just to survive, and this is what ended up taking me through. I was asked, did the charges have any merit? The Turkish government they accused me of different things at different times, trying to make something stick. So at first I was accused of human trafficking, then speaking negatively about Turkey to refugees and helping them leave Turkey. Let me just say at the beginning that none of these things were true. I was then accused of going to Syria to support the PKK, which is a Kurdish terror group. Then accused of saying positive things about Gulen in a meeting. That's what they held me in prison for at the beginning, of supporting the Gulen movement. Then of military espionage, helping to plan the attempted coup of 2016. And that came with 3 life sentences. That was felt like a death sentence to me. So 3 life sentences with no possibility of parole and solitary confinement. And also, I was accused of supporting the PKK, so they were going to add another 35 years onto the 3 life sentences, just to make sure. At my trial, so I was accused of all of these things. These did not have merit. At my trial, it came out clearly in the indictment and in the questioning from the judges that my missionary activity, I had been in Turkey for 23 years, working and starting churches. And then the last 2 years, so 25 years total, the last 2 years in prison. What came out in my trial was very much underlining the missionary activity, our religious work, our church work, and emphasizing that I was attempting to Christianize the country or Christianize the Kurds, and in that way cause division in Turkey and lead to a Kurdish state that would be Christian. So the UN working group, United Nations working group on arbitrary detention did take up my case, and they concluded that I was held because of my nationality and specifically because of my faith. I was asked about Turkish policy toward prisoners. What did other prisoners face? They faced the same kind of thing I did. Obviously, I was in a unique situation. The only person held, well, the only American citizen who was not a dual citizen, a Turkish citizen also. And obviously the only person accused of Christianization. But the many prisoners I was held with, they faced the same conditions of not having any certainty, of the judicial process being very slow, being held for a year or two without any charges brought against them. My experience of the people I was kept in prison with, I don't think that, it did not seem to me that any of them were involved in any violence or were a threat to the state. And what does my personal experience reveal about Turkey more broadly? Turkey has changed a lot over the last 18 years. I think we all see the direction it's going. President Erdogan is very clearly an Islamist, and he is proud to say this, and he's taking Turkey in that direction.
Do you want to unmute yourself and then welcome the next speaker? Welcome, Amberin.
Amberin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and opportunity to speak. And once again, Andrew, geçmiş olsun. I'm so sorry to hear. I mean, we all know what you went through, but hearing it from you now again is just heartbreaking, and I'm really sorry. And you ended your presentation on a note that I wish to pick up, the one of President Erdogan being a proud Islamist. Well, when he first came to power back in 2002, when the AKP rose to power, in fact, they abhorred that label, Islamist. And so what I'd like to try and do is to provide some context and background on why we are where we are today with people like the pastor being hauled off to jail on these ridiculous charges. And might I add that had I been in Turkey, I would probably be in jail now too, because there's a warrant for my detention because apparently I'm a terrorist. But as I said, when they first came to power, they absolutely abhorred that label. And in fact, we would get telephone calls from senior AKP officials telling us we could not call them Islamists, that they were not Islamists. And so how did we get here? What's going on? I mean, it's very clear to all of us now today that, as the pastor said, that President Erdogan is very proud of his Islamist identity, and he's going full steam with what seems like an Islamist civilizational project to transform Turkey from a secular republic into one that fits his ideological mold. So over the past few months, we've seen some really stunning developments, things that we never imagined could have happened, like the Hagia Sophia, which you mentioned, which is now a full service mosque. And you would think that having done that, having transformed this World Heritage Site into a mosque, if that was indeed what his base wanted, why would he then proceed to do the same with a smaller mosque, church actually, the Kora Church, the museum which houses all these fantastic mosaics? Why would there be any need to transform that into a mosque as well? Well, that's just happened. There are so many manifestations of this Islamist mindset, and one that is also threatening to many Christians. We've seen an uptick in hate speech against non-Muslims, particularly against Jews. And with the government sort of leveraging this sort of polarizing language against these minorities to sort of bolster its standing, its base. Because the reason why a lot of this is happening, in fact, is directly connected on the one hand to, yes, Mr. Erdogan's ideological mindset that in the initial days he sought to disguise. Why? Because he was trying to sort of endear himself to the European Union. He felt he needed that EU track in order to tackle his biggest enemy, which was the army at the outset. And he's now pretty much achieved that. The army has been pretty much defanged. But at the same time, it's not only the way he views the world, but it's also because he's in a very desperate economic situation now, because the Turkish economy is pretty much in free fall. If you measure it by the health of the lira, well, it gives you a very clear picture of where things stand. It's lost more than 20% of its value this year alone and continues to fall. You look at Erdogan's poll numbers and they're beginning to shrink. So what do you do to sort of try and save yourself? Well, he's leveraging this sort of Islamist ideology, and unfortunately, we see it now not just only targeting the non-Muslim community, but also the Kurdish community in Syria. This language of conquest of Islam, of fusing Turkish nationalism with Islamic rhetoric is being leveraged in Turkey's overseas adventures, aggressive sort of interventions in Syria, in Libya. So all of this, of course, is extremely threatening, alarming for the communities within Turkey and now increasingly outside Turkey. And another more recent development is the one of Turkey also, this government using Islam to mobilize Turkish diaspora communities inside Europe. You know, there are around 5 million ethnic Turks living in Europe, but not only in Europe, in the Middle East as well. In places like Lebanon, you see, again, Erdogan using Islam to mobilize local Sunni communities against Armenians there. And perhaps Mr. Bedrosyan will have more to say about that. But the alarming, as the pastor said, the direction is extremely alarming. And what's really troubling, I just recently did a piece on how now there's this sort of a systematic expulsion of Protestants ongoing in Turkey. So the plan really seems to be to expunge Turkey as much as possible of the presence of Protestant missionaries, but also the policy of throwing up these bureaucratic hurdles for all the the Lausanne community, non-Muslim communities that are recognized by the Lausanne Treaty, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian, and the Jewish communities, this sort of unremitting set of hurdles that get thrown up, which in my view are really tailored to sort of wear them down and sort of shrink the community and to sort of basically as I said, Turkify and Sunnify the country. This seems to be the goal, very much the goal. And at the same time, as I said, doing mobilizing Muslims outside Turkey, Turkish Muslims outside Turkey to sort of actually, in some ways, create leverage over the countries that host them. This is another very troubling development. But to get back to my initial point about the Protestants, when I did this story about the ongoing expulsion of Protestant missionaries from Turkey, I was very much hoping that I'd get a reaction, because this was widely circulated, this story. And I was hoping that the Congress would say something, but we've really heard nothing. And I'd be very curious to hear from Pastor Brunson, because I'm sure he's working hard to raise awareness about this. Why is there so much silence? The silence is absolutely deafening. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Amber. One would have hoped that after hearing Pastor Brunson, one might be able to hope that you could get things a little bit better, but alas, things only appear to be getting worse and metastasizing. If I may now pass to Elizabeth Prodromou from Tufts University, from the Fletcher School. Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you as well to David for hosting all of us and for organizing this panel. And thank you, Pastor Brunson, for sharing what you experienced and endured, and really shedding a light on the human dimension of many of the issues that we usually discuss in terms of high policy conversations. I was asked to speak in particular about the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community in Turkey. And I wanted to talk about that community within a broader context, namely the two recent cultural heritage decisions that have been quite mediatized. The decision to revert the Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine Orthodox cathedral, to a mosque, but also the re-announcement of the decision by Turkish courts. It was actually taken in November of 2019, and it was a signal of what was to come with the Hagia Sophia in the middle of this year, which was the decision to revert the Hora Church of the Savior to a mosque as well. And I wanted to say a bit about cultural heritage policy, in particular the way it's been used to target the ecumenical patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox community, but as part of a larger cultural heritage toolbox by which the Turkish state has moved in the direction, as Amberin pointed out, of this homogenization project when it comes to nationalism. And most specifically, I want to say a few things about the need, I think, to revise the narrative about Turkey. And I would push back a little bit on this notion that the election of the AKP and Erdogan's rise to, consolidate an authoritarian, some might even say a totalitarian style regime in Turkey, is a dramatic shift from what came before. Because I think if we look at cultural heritage policy, we'll see that, unfortunately, since the establishment of the Republic in 1923, the Kemalist governments have utilized cultural heritage to homogenize the population religiously and ethnically, to develop a kind of exclusivist nationalism, and to use that exclusivist nationalism for geopolitical purposes as well. And that has had certainly implications for the fits and starts of democratization in Turkey, but it also helps to explain why we are where we are now. So in terms of this narrative of there was once a secular democratic Turkey and now there's an Islamist authoritarian Turkey, I think things are more complex than that. And cultural heritage policy and the two recent decisions that I mentioned give us a window into thinking, to helping to historicize the policy dilemmas that, a pro-democracy Turks are pursuing, and that the US and its NATO partners hopefully are pursuing in terms of engagement with Turkey. So just a brief note on cultural heritage. As I mentioned, really the well springs of of the cultural heritage policy that we see in the two recent decisions are found with the establishment of the Republic, when Mustafa Kemal mobilized a cross-disciplinary cadre of state-supported professional intellectuals who were dedicated to creating a new national identity project. And that was expressed in the Turkish historical thesis. And cultural heritage, cultural and religious heritage, whether movable or immovable properties, whether tangible or intangible heritage, was seen as integral to creating this new modern Turkish nationalism. And that's a nationalism then that when it came to cultural heritage, either appropriated or destroyed and erased or reconfigured the role and the indigeneity of Christian communities and then the Jewish community inside Turkey in a new kind of historical narrative. And so within these parameters then, the Turkish state began to use cultural heritage as a means to erase both the historical presence, but also the living, sustainable Christian communities in Turkey. And the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, therefore, and the Greek Orthodox Christian community simply become a kind of emblem of a series of broader policies and trends that affect all of the other Christian communities in Turkey, Armenian, Syriac, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and also non-Sunni communities, so Jewish and also Alevis considered non-conforming Muslims. And so people oftentimes ask, well, why is everyone talking about the ecumenical patriarchate? Because they're, to use the colloquial expression, they're the canary in the coal mine when it comes to religious freedom, but more specifically, they're emblematic of what's befallen the whole set of non-Sunni and also non-Turkish communities, minority communities in Turkey. And I want to say a little bit then about the religious heritage and cultural heritage policy. It's the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Tourism that historically have been authorized to deal with the appropriation, the commercialization, the destruction of the cultural heritage sites of Christian communities and other communities. But increasingly, and this is under the Kemalists, increasingly under, I'll say the Erdoganists, under this regime, there has been a shift in authority and a massive shift in the budgetary allocations for managing cultural heritage to the Diyanet, the Directorate General of Religious Affairs, which is symbolic as well of the informing of an active religious agenda into the management of cultural heritage. And interestingly enough, it's the Diyanet that has been authorized to manage the Hagia Sophia and the Hora Church. And so again, just to choose some emblematic examples, we can see the reversion of the three other Hagia Sophias. I've called this in my work the Hagia Sophia fetish of the Turkish government. The reversion to a mosque of the Hagia Sophias in Izmir, in Edirne, and in sorry, I haven't had my coffee yet. One other Hagia Sophia and Trabzon into mosques as the precursor and the trial balloons of the conversion this summer of the great Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. There has been the commercialization of properties. For example, the beautiful monastic caves in the Black Sea area. Those have been converted into five-star, luxury hotels that, people go on tourism junkets to and take hot air balloons there. So, the desacralization and the desecration of sacred sites for commercial purposes. There have been, assaults on Armenian local sites in Istanbul, for example, an orphanage that has been appropriated by the Turkish state to use for commercial purposes. And we can go on and on and on. But the most important point is that the use of cultural heritage policy has been very systematic and deliberate. And it's aimed, number one, to destroy the remains, the physical remains that speak to the historic presence of these indigenous communities, or to repurpose them within this narrative of Turkish nationalism, whereby these communities were latecomers rather than the indigenous communities in Anatolia, or to use them commercially as a kind of tourist mechanism that diverts attention away from the cultural and religious heritage function of these properties. And this has led us to where we are in many ways, the use of religion and culture to reconfigure Turkish nationalism in a way that excludes people who define themselves as secular, and more generally, people who are comfortable with pluralism, the pluralism of ideas and the pluralism of identities. And that has had enormous consequences then for Turkey's geopolitical agenda, which is a geopolitical agenda of, as this current government speaks about, a neo-Ottoman geopolitical agenda of revising the borders of the Turkish state, of redrawing borders in the Eastern Med and the Middle East, of hegemony, maritime geopolitical hegemony under the Mavi Vatan, the 3 Cs strategy. And we see it in the maps that have been produced by the Turkish Foreign Ministry in the last several years that include portions of Syria, Iraq, and Greece as part of a greater Turkey. So there's a geopolitical agenda that is leveraged by virtue of this cultural heritage policy. And I think, as Amberin so rightly pointed out, this is a transcontinental and a global strategy. And I would close with one footnote, which is the proposal, the request for a memorandum of understanding between the Republic of Turkey and the United States government. That was submitted by the Republic of Turkey to the Cultural Property Advisory Committee in the US Department of State in their Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs in late 2019. And what that would do is that it would prohibit the US from importing anything that the government of Turkey determines as Turkish cultural heritage from the Paleolithic period up until 1923. So it would place into a straitjacket the control of the indigenous communities over their own religious and cultural heritage. And interestingly enough, international organizations and US professional associations who are experts in museum management, cultural heritage protection, and religious freedom have submitted statements to the Bureau of Education Cultural Affairs categorically condemning that proposed MOU, because not only does it violate the US Cultural Protection Implementation Act, the threshold of which needs to be reached to sign such an MOU, but as all of these associations so eloquently summarize, the greatest threat to Turkey's cultural heritage, particularly when it comes to its minority communities, has unfortunately been the Turkish state itself. And that's been a reality since the founding of the Republic under self-styled Kemalist secularist regimes, as well as now more openly under the current Erdoganist regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. If I may now invite Raffi Bedrosyan to conclude the speakers before we go to the Q&A. Over to you, Raffi. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank Professor Phillips for inviting me to this panel discussion. I would like to recognize Pastor Brunson for his bravery and perseverance. It's not easy to survive for 2 years in a Turkish prison. I didn't meet Dr. Prodromou and Dr. Kaplan until today, but I know Ms. Amberin Zaman as a courageous journalist in Turkey from her enlightening and objective articles. My remarks today are based on my research and travels in Turkey. First, let me give a historic context to the religious minorities in Turkey. Prior to World War I, the main minority groups, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and the Jews, and a handful of Protestants and Catholics, numbered several million and a significant percentage of the population in Turkey. With the Armenian and Assyrian genocides during World War I, followed by the genocide of the Greeks in the Black Sea Pontus region, and the deportation of the Greeks from Izmir and the Aegean coast, Minorities were eliminated from all over Turkey, except for the communities remaining in Istanbul. Vast amounts of wealth and properties of the minorities were passed on to the Turks. The Armenians alone left behind more than 5,000 churches, monasteries, and schools. During World War II, further economic transfer of wealth from the minorities in Istanbul to the Turks was implemented by imposing a wealth tax on the Armenians, Greeks, and the Jews. There were pogroms against Jews in the 1930s, against Greeks in 1950s, attacks on Jewish synagogues in 1980s and early 2000s, further reducing the minority population. And today, the religious minorities number less than 100,000, or 0.1% of the Turkish population of 80 million. Focusing on the Armenians living in Istanbul, they are tolerated to exist as long as they do not mention any past injustices or historic wrongs. If anyone dares to speak up, they are silenced, like my late friend Hrant Dink. Although Armenians are legally equal citizens on paper, they cannot be employed in the public sector, even as a garbage collector. The state prevents or interferes in the election of the Armenian Patriarch and the directors of the charitable foundations. Armenians depend on the limited revenue of the charitable foundations for the maintenance of their schools and churches. Many of the properties donated or willed to these charitable foundations were confiscated by the state in a legalized robbery in past years. And some 10% of these properties are now returned recently after Armenians appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. The word Armenian is used as a swear or insult word by the Turks. Studies show that Armenians are still the #1 hate target in media, followed by Greeks, Jews, and recently Syrians. Abandoned Armenian churches and cemeteries in different parts of Turkey are regularly attacked and desecrated, most recently the Ankara cemetery. The state has taken a few token positive steps, like restoring the Armenian church on Ahtamar Island in Lake Van, but only as a museum, restricting the use of it as an Armenian church by the rightful owners, the Armenians, to only 1 day per year. In the meantime, thousands of other churches are treasure hunting sites. Turks still hope to find buried treasures left behind by the Armenians after 100 years. And there are dozens of Turkish websites describing clues and signs on how to find Armenian treasures. Digging around or under the foundations further accelerates the destruction of still standing Armenian churches in different parts of Turkey. Now I would like to talk about the new realities of a minority within a minority, the hidden Armenians. During the 1915 genocide, there were thousands of Armenian orphans left behind in Turkey. Some were taken to Turkish state orphanages, forcibly Islamized and Turkified. Some orphan boys were taken to military schools and trained as Turkish soldiers. Many Armenian girls were sold as slaves. Thousands of Armenian children were snatched from deportation convoys and taken to Turkish and Kurdish homes and Islamized. These were the living victims of the genocide. It has now become apparent that many of these orphans secretly kept their Armenian identity and passed on this secret to their children and grandchildren, often on their deathbed. And almost 100 years after the genocide, some of the present generation hidden Armenians showed the courage and desire to return to their Armenian roots, culture, and in some cases, back to Christianity. One of the events that triggered this desire to return to Armenian identity was the reconstruction of the Armenian church in Diyarbakir, southeastern Turkey. This church was the largest Armenian church in Middle East, partially destroyed in 1915 and eventually abandoned and near collapse. Until 2009, when a few individuals initiated its reconstruction against all odds. When it reopened in 2012, it acted like a magnet, bringing together hidden Armenians who started organizing monthly breakfast meetings, sharing stories, supporting one another. Concerts, conferences, and art exhibitions took place in the newly consecrated church. Armenian language classes were started. I took several groups of hidden and no longer hidden Armenians from various regions of Turkey to Armenia so that they can discover their original roots, culture, and history. Despite the increased discrimination and hatred after being identified as Armenian, these people still take the risk to return to their roots. Unfortunately, these hopeful developments all came to a crashing halt in 2015 when the Turkish state responded very harshly to the Kurdish demands for increased rights and local autonomy. The army moved into several southeastern provinces with tanks and heavy artillery, causing massive destruction and damage. Entire neighborhoods were razed to the ground and tens of thousands of civilians were left homeless. The Armenian church in Diyarbakir was also damaged. The state expropriated the church and used it as military headquarters. Thankfully, the church foundation appealed to higher courts and successfully reversed the expropriation legislation. In recent years, intolerance, discrimination, and hatred against religious minorities are on the rise by a large portion of the Turkish society. In fact, not only the religious minorities, but anyone who is not a Sunni Muslim Turk is targeted. Unfortunately, the state turns a blind eye to this fact and instead chooses to punish liberal-minded Turkish individuals like Osman Kavala and lawyer Eren Keskin, who have heroically defended cultural rights and human rights of all the people living in Turkey. Thank you very much.
David, will you be introducing the Q&A session?
Yes, I will. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to pick up on something that Raffi said about the destruction of churches. When I was chairing the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission, we had a meeting with Ambassador Luten in Istanbul, and he rather gleefully admitted that Turkey had set about destroying all the Armenian churches in Turkey. He lamented the fact that we didn't destroy them all because there were just too many of them. So we've seen over a long period of time the systematic destruction of religious identity and the symbols of religious identity in the form of churches and other icons. We were involved in a project to restore Akdamar. There were several years of negotiations just to have a cross installed at the top of the church. And then when the church was opened, it turned into a publicity stunt. And now, as Raffi's pointed out, it's only open one day a year for actual religious services. So we have a number of questions about Armenian issues, and I'd like to refer them to my friend and colleague, Van Krikorian. Van, one questioner asks about the history of US policy towards Turkey and recognition of the Armenian genocide. This is something in which you've been involved over many decades. Could you tell us about that history and where we are today? Maggie, can you unmute Van?
Got it. So,
Okay.
You know, I could, and we discussed it a little bit last week as well, in terms of the history of it. I prefer to be brief on that, though, and focus more on the subject for today. You know, for decades, there was never a question in the minds of Americans or Armenians or anybody else. The United States understood that there was an Armenian genocide. When the Genocide Convention came along, the clear history of it was to include the Armenian genocide. Raphael Lemkin, the author of it, noted that genocide can be defined as what happened to the Armenians, and when the United States submitted its legal position to the International Court of Justice in The Hague in 1950s, it acknowledged that squarely. And it wasn't until the sort of, I will say, very secretive but effective impact of Turkish lobbying then on the State Department began to take root in the early 1980s, and the State Department published for the very first time a note at the end of an article questioning whether there was an Armenian genocide, and that triggered efforts to have Congress correct that error. President Reagan acknowledged there was an Armenian genocide, but that really joined the battle that continued until last year, when both houses, Senate and House, passed resolutions overwhelmingly by historic margins, reaffirming the U.S. record. And I don't know if you'll allow me to talk about the actual subject for today, but if not now, I guess I could do it later, or I can just keep my thoughts to myself.
Okay, Van, thank you for that. We have a question from a Turkish American about U.S. policy, and it piggybacks on a statement that Amberin, who I so greatly respect and admire, presented as a question to Pastor Brunson. Amberin raised the question of deafening silence. Why is the United States so quiet about Turkey's abuses of religious freedom? And what should be done to raise further awareness about Turkey's human rights abuses and its violations of democratic norms? Pastor Brunson, since you've been spending a lot of time in Washington speaking about your personal experience, maybe you can be the first to try to address this question, this sweeping question.
I have friends who've asked this question in Germany, and the answer comes down to financial ties to Turkey in Europe. That's what someone in the German Foreign Service said. In the US, I think there's still a concern that no one wants to lose Turkey, and there is hope. I think it's a minority hope now that after Erdogan, Turkey will turn back to the West. And so there's an attempt to retain those ties in hope that when there's a change of administration that they will be able to pull them back. And I don't know that that's going to happen. And of course, one clear factor is that President Trump has a good relationship with President Erdogan, and that affects things as well.
So maybe you can elaborate a little bit, Pastor Brunson. President Trump relies support
It's Tom here. While David appears to be frozen, perhaps I'll try to interject. Pastor Brunson, how is it possible that in your mind, that the evangelical community, which has been so stalwart in supporting
Christian,
would be relatively silent on the issue of what's happening to Christians in Turkey, as well as we heard last week, in Syria?
I think that many people don't know what's happening just in the evangelical community. And there are so many other things competing for attention, so many crises, that this gets pushed to the back burner.
Would it be fair to say that the nationalists and the Islamists, the Erdogan government, in effect, has used COVID and the fact that almost all countries, arguably and understandably, are focused inward in order to be able to accelerate their own agenda within Turkey and abroad?
I think
And
they've
maybe
been
this
doing that.
Pardon, go
I
ahead.
think they've been doing that, especially since the coup. And I don't think that they really care very much about what outsiders think right now. I don't think there's a lot of leverage that people are willing to use against Turkey.
Van, I saw you nodding vigorously. Would you like to add something to that?
I would actually. You know, I think you absolutely put your finger on it, and I think Pastor Brunson answered it very accurately. That there is a complete lack of awareness of this sort of Orwellian hypocrisy of saying that, you know, Turkey was a secular or is still a secular democracy when it absolutely isn't. And if people knew what was actually going on, then U.S. policy would be substantially different. David has done a good job pointing up, you know, President Erdogan's comments of, you know, democracy is like a streetcar. When you get to your stop, you get off, to reflect what happened, you know, to what level of democracy there had been in Turkey and how far that's deteriorated today. You know, just out of curiosity, I was checking to see who else had picked up on that, and I saw that, you know, Europeans are picking up on it by saying that Turkey's European aspirations could also be characterized as like a streetcar. They got to their stop and they got off. The same has been historically true. There was mention of Treaty of Lausanne and how certain religious minorities are protected, and that has, you know, great sympathy and concern for other minorities as well as those named there. But that's exactly the problem, that they might use the same words that people in the West want to hear because of financial interests, because of perceived military interests, because of really substantial investments by the United States in the relationship. But it's time to reconsider, it's past time to reconsider all of them because they no longer reflect reality.
Van, we lost some of your comment, but let me just add a word about Turkey's NATO membership. NATO is more than a security alliance. It's a coalition of countries with shared values. And because Turkey today is Islamist, hostile to human rights, and anti-American and anti-Western, if Turkey sought NATO membership today, it simply wouldn't even be considered. So the way Turkey was and the way Turkey is needs to be fully considered. You know, no more wishful thinking or happy talk. Let me go back to the question that we have about the relationship between Christians and Kurds, both historically and today. And we're joined in today's conference by Giran Ozcan, who is in Washington as a representative of the HDP. Giran, if you're online and can hear me, could you try to address this question?
Hi, David. Oh, thank you for the opportunity. I wasn't expecting it, but I'll give it a go because, I mean, I think we can say that both communities, especially in Turkey, as we've heard testimonies and the accounts that have been given by previous speakers, that both communities are being suppressed, brutally suppressed by an administration that believes that the 80-year republic prior to Erdogan was just a gap in Turkey's 700-year history, going all the way back to the Ottoman Empire. The secular Turkey that was founded by Mustafa Kemal, according to people that think like Erdogan and who are running Turkey right now, was just a short break of this Turkic Islamist empire. And Turkey now is trying to revive, under Erdogan, trying to revive that. And the people and the communities that are first to suffer are the non-Turkish Sunni communities. And the Kurds are non-Turkish, the Christians are non-Sunni, the Alevi Kurd, of which I am an Alevi Kurd, we suffer on both counts. So there is a joint destiny there. There is a shared destiny there, which is, as we've heard from all the accounts, which is now intensifying Erdogan, and it's actually breaching Turkish borders as well. As you know, the Kurds and the Christians of Rojava are suffering every day right now. There are still talk of operation. There are currently ongoing in northern Iraq. The Yazidi community, which we have today, but we've mentioned on other occasions, are suffering the same fate. And so there is a whole joint and shared destiny that a lot of minorities in the region are facing right now. And I think especially events like these are very useful to highlight that and see how we can get countries and governments like the US to engage in a much more peaceful and stable way than they've done previously. And what Amberin was mentioning, the deafening silence, I think there are definitely several reasons for that, but I'm also looking to the 3rd of November now and seeing what kind of an impact that will have on the current silence going forward.
So an inescapable reality is the collapsing Turkish economy and the depreciated value of the lira. Tom, maybe you could speak about this. Why is Turkey's economy struggling? And what can be done to leverage its economic performance into a reform agenda so that Turkey can address problems like the persecution of Christians?
Unfortunately, and obviously within this conversation, there's the question of to what extent Erdogan has been accelerating trends that were already in place prior to 2002, 2003, etc. But I think that what we're seeing with the Erdogan government, and it's being reflected in the economy, is a race to the bottom. And that as the economy deteriorates, his desperation to be able to appeal to a constituency that's willing to back him, let's call it his base, for want of a better word. It's not just Islamist, it's also nationalist. There's a direct correlation between his pushing against almost all of his borders and the deterioration in the economy. The question, or it's a rhetorical question, is this. I've met him, and I concluded that he is brilliant at what he does, but that he effectively thinks that most foreigners or those who would potentially be adversaries are really not very bright. And I want to put this forward because he thinks that through a policy of deception, which he's now unmasked, I don't think since the invasion of northern Syria, I don't think anyone now in the West has any illusions as to his agenda. He's in northern Syria, he's in northern Iraq, he's in Libya, he's in Somalia, he's in the Eastern Mediterranean, he's moving into Lebanon. He referred yesterday to the United Nations. He referred to the Israelis, in effect Jews, we know he's anti-Semitic, as using filthy hands in Jerusalem, which is, it would be almost amusing were it not so tragic. When you consider the sanctuary that he's given to Hamas, which has as its objective the destruction of the Jewish state. Whatever you might want to say about PKK, whether you think they're terrorists or you think that they're a liberation organization, and I use the word liberation organization because that's how he refers to Hamas. The PKK does not have as its objective as establishing a Kurdish state with its capital in Ankara or Istanbul. So what we're dealing with is someone who's willing to use the shiny little ball, obfuscation, in order to be able to advance an agenda abroad that is meant to mask the deterioration of the economic situation at home, brought about by a lack of business confidence, brought about by the perception that the system is corrupt, that the corruption goes to the top. There's that old Russian proverb, a fish rots from the head down, that the family is a kleptocracy, and surrounded by crony capitalism at best, propped up by Qatar, whose agenda is to support, not coincidentally, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the economic situation, in a way, is a metaphor for Turkey going backwards. This is an incredible country with an incredible civilization. The fact that they've aligned themselves with a backward looking Islamo-nationalist agenda is extremely unfortunate, not just for Turkey's minorities, but also for, I do believe that if given the opportunity to have a free and fair election that is not rigged, that this may very well change. And the short answer to your question, after having given a very long answer, is that you need a new government that represents what I believe to be the true majority will of the Turkish people.
So let me make a statement about Turkey's lobbying efforts, and then we'll go to the panelists for a final statement. Turkey has discovered K Street. It spends tens of millions of dollars annually paying lobbyists and consultants. It also has penetrated five-star think tanks and NGOs, organizations like the Atlantic Council, take millions of dollars each year from Turkish oligarchs who derive their money entirely from government contracts. So there's something a little warped about US-Turkish relations when they play the lobbying game so effectively, making it hard for the truth that we've discussed today to surface and to become a more fundamental factor in US policy. So let's now turn to the panelists and ask if they have a brief closing statement to make. And we'll do it in the same sequence that they presented. Anadrew Brunson?
Yeah, I think that much of the oppression in Turkey right now is being done in the name of Islam. And I think that Erdogan has been trying to raise what he called the pious generation, and that this is going to backfire. That because the oppression is being done in the name of Islam, similarly to Iran after the Iranian Revolution, that there are going to be many people who turn against this in Turkey. And we're already seeing this, especially in the younger generation.
I would hope that people in the Christian and evangelical communities here in the US would understand that more clearly and raise their voices in protest, not only of Turkey's policies, but also the Trump administration's support for them. Let's now go to Amberin.
I think, first of all, I want to say that I completely agree with Elizabeth that Turkey's bad behavior did not begin with Erdogan, and that religious minorities have always been treated with suspicion, even before the Kemalist revolution, even in late Ottoman times, always scapegoated and regarded as fifth columnists. Insofar as elections, I do share Thomas's sort of concerns that, you know, we may be at an inflection point here. And even if, as the pastor said, a growing number of people are turning against Erdogan, and certainly the poll numbers show us that, and the fact that the economy, which is what, you know, really drove his success for all these years, is now crumbling, does that all point to a change in government if and when we have elections which are due to be held in 2023? Well, the big question is, will we have those elections, or will Erdogan, you know, in his desperation, sort of kick into full sort of Turkmenistan, Venezuela mode? But the sort of happy news, I think, is however much the Western world, the United States, the EU, doesn't seem to be focusing on the persecution of Christians, minorities, and Kurds. And let's face it, even before Erdogan, the US couldn't care less about the Kurds or human rights abuses, really, because that's when, you know, Turkey was being a good ally and not buying Russian missiles. The good news is that the Europeans, at least, are pushing back, and we're seeing that play out now in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the threat of EU sanctions has forced Erdogan to back down. So obviously, being tough, calling his bluffs works, and that's, you know, what we should all remember, what policymakers, what the administration should remember, take note of.
Amber, let me just second your comment about the S-400 missiles. Under CATSA, the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, the US government is obliged to impose sanctions on Turkey for purchasing sophisticated Russian weaponry. That requires action from the executive in Washington, and we're not seeing any action. We're seeing a blind eye turn to Turkey's crimes and also its rapprochement and collaboration with Russia, not only on weapons acquisition, but also in Syria. Elizabeth, let me turn to you.
Thank you. I would just say a couple of things. First is to ask us to think like historians if we want to actually develop feasible policies to help Turkey recover and redirect towards a more democratic trajectory, and a trajectory that reflects what the NATO Charter calls for, that all member states actually protect peoples and protect the principles of individual rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So I think in order to move Turkey in that direction, we need to think like historians and recognize that Turkish policymakers think in terms of the long time horizon of history. And I would just call our attention to some dates that are important. Why July 20th for the first celebration of in Hagia Sophia as a mosque? That was the date of the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, which Erdogan has stated that he considers illegitimate, which drew the borders of contemporary Turkey. On August 26th this year, Erdogan celebrated the Battle of Manzikert and the Seljuk victory in 1071, and made a statement vis-a-vis Greece, a neighboring country, and said, you know, we'll take from Greece whatever is ours. In 1922, we have the approaching 100-year anniversary of the burning of Smyrna, the Great Fire of Smyrna that destroyed the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish populations in Smyrna. And then, of course, in 1923, we have the centennial of the founding of the Republic, and Erdogan has been very clear about his goal of superseding Ataturk as the greatest leader in Turkish history. So I think we need to think as policymakers about how history actually matters, and historical dates are used as inflection points for what is perpetrated against the country's religious minorities, and also in terms of the geopolitical agenda. So watch for those inflection points. And then finally, I would just say that language matters. And this is where I think we need to really emphasize that, you know, going back to some sort of normal in no way will, you know, be a positive thing for the country's vulnerable religious and ethnic minority communities. I mean, it was, you know, Inonu, a secularist, in the 60s who developed the Eritme program, the melting program, the cleansing program that was implemented on the islands of Imvros and Tenedos, putting an open-air prison on Tenedos, which meant the flight of the local Greek Orthodox population. It was Ecevit, a committed secularist leftist in 1974, who presided over the invasion intervention, and now still occupation of northern Cyprus. So language matters, and the way that we think about what secular means in the case of Turkey has in no way meant the separation of religion from state. It simply meant the control of religion by the state, where state has meant different forms of regime type. So I think these are important things for policymakers to take into account. And I think Amberin, probably better than anyone, knows the importance of that language and how it's used domestically in Turkey, and how it's been used, as you said, David, on K Street and in the lobbying space for branding certain kinds of actions. So my simple conclusion is that now moving forward in Turkey isn't a return to something preceding Erdogan. It's recognizing that Erdogan and the Erdoganists grew out of what preceded it, and to take a harder stand, to use the toolbox, the diplomatic toolbox, whether it's CAATSA sanctions or Magnitsky sanctions, or whether it's USURF designation, or whether it's quiet diplomacy or interfaith diplomacy, at a time, in fact, when the region suggests new possibilities. In the embrace of religious pluralism with the normalization of UAE, Bahrain, Oman, and Israeli relations. So I would ask us to focus on language and think about history, and not fall into the category trap of thinking that once Erdogan and the AKP leave, that things will be great, because they're using the very policy tools that were provided for them when they were elected in 2002. Thank you.
Elizabeth, while we're worried about language, Erdogan will be judged not by only what he says, by what he does.
Absolutely.
What he's said about the Lausanne Treaty is deeply worrisome to several countries, especially Greece. And what he's done, provoking conflict with Greece through maritime and air conflicts, could easily escalate into a live fire exchange between two NATO members that would be deeply worrisome to the NATO alliance and to the United States. So we have to be vigilant and monitor what is said and what is done. Raffi, to you.
Historically, in Turkey, the minorities were used as scapegoats whenever the countries that the minorities belonged to had problems with Turkey. For example, whenever there were problems with Cyprus or Greece, then the Greek community in Turkey paid for it. Or whenever the Armenian genocide issue came up in the states as resolutions, then the Armenian minority in Turkey suffered, as well as the Jewish community minority in Turkey was pressured to convince the Jews in the US House and Senate to turn down any resolution that may come up. So now the minorities in Turkey are so little, so few that they cannot be used as blackmail. So that's one point. And secondly, there was at the beginning of 2002, 2003, when Erdogan was first elected, there were a few years of hope or window of small steps toward democratization or getting close to EU and EU values. But that has now completely been erased as Erdogan gained power and eliminated the threat of any military coups against him. So the situation doesn't look good right now in Turkey.
So you speak about the few minorities in Turkey. We should recognize that up to 20 million citizens are of Kurdish origin. And we almost reflexively talk about the PKK as a terror group. We should recognize that Kurds in Turkey have been systematically violated and victimized. And if there's ever going to be a successful negotiation between the Turkish state and the Kurds of Turkey, it will require incentives such as delisting the PKK from the list of foreign terrorist organizations, and Turkey making accommodation and abiding by democratic norms for all of its people. Giran, I'm sure you would agree with that. Maybe we'll have another broader discussion later on. Before we adjourn, let me turn to Tom and see if he has a word of closing.
Well, I would say this. I don't think that there's anything that comes out of this panel discussion that gives us a sense of immediate encouragement. The level of discrimination which is taking place in Turkey would appear to be accelerating. That acceleration, again, is a function, as one often sees throughout history, of deteriorating economic conditions, which in turn lead to a desire to deflect attention from conditions at home to possible provocations and possibly even shooting wars abroad in order to be able to summon the nationalism that might quiet those concerns. I would say this: those of us who intend to do what we can to shine a light on what's going on in Turkey and what is going on as a consequence of the policies of this government abroad, a rapidly growing cohort, if I may say, have to also understand that there is hope. This is not a question about what is necessarily an inveterate Islamic hostility towards minorities. That does not have to be the case. Even those who might not subscribe right now to an Andalusian fantasy would have to acknowledge, as Elizabeth pointed out, that there are changes afoot. You see it in the Saudi media. You see it, of course, so clearly reflected in the approach of the UAE, which has been leading the way in showing rapprochement with Christianity and Judaism, as symbolized by the building of a religious structure that will jointly be a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, not to mention, of course, the normalization with Israel. There are trends, and not surprisingly, there is the building of a coalition which has, until relatively recently, been focused primarily on the Islamic politics of Iran, to now the Sunni Iran for many, which is the Turkish Republic. I recall sitting in an interview a number of years ago, with the late Bernard Lewis, a historian from Princeton. And a lot of the discussion was on the Arab-Israeli dispute. But at the end, someone asked a question of him and said, "What about Turkey? What do you have to say about that?" And Bernard smiled to himself, and I can't imitate the accent, but he said, "I know that you'll regard this perhaps as the musings of an old man, but I can one day see where the most pro-Western democracy amongst the Muslim states in the Middle East will be in Iran, and the center of Islamic fundamentalism will be Turkey." And that was an aha moment for the entire audience. And yet, I have to say, it looks like Bernard got it right. And once again, if I may say, David, I'd like to thank you and Maggie and the whole team for putting together this series, for giving JFK the privilege of being able to produce it with you and to co-host it. It's always a great pleasure and an honor to fly in your airspace. Thank you, my friend. And
So
thank you for a wonderful, wonderful panel for really, really enlightening in so many ways.
So let me just comment on your remark that Bernard Lewis got it right. Yes, he's a famous historian. He's also a notorious denier of the Armenian genocide. I met with him at his home in Princeton a number of times. Whereas I respect his academic credentials, I can't respect his denial of genocide. It's very positive that both the Senate and the House has recognized the Armenian genocide. I hope we can see a similar recognition of the Pontiac genocide, and that people, including our panelists and Pastor Brunson, can exert themselves more vigorously to raising awareness about Turkey's persecution of Christians, not only in Turkey, but in Syria, and also express that concern to the administration in Washington, which has given a green light to Erdogan's crimes. So with that, let me just thank the panelists, thank the participants. We've had a very rich and full discussion. We've considerably surpassed our deadline, but that's only because the presentations were so substantive and the discussion was so good. So with that, we adjourn and we express our appreciation and respect. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.